Hello everyone and welcome back to a new video on my channel. In this video I would like to talk about using the Canon EOS 450D and the Canon EOS 6D for deep sky astrophotography. So I've been using all of these two cameras for astrophotography multiple times, and in this video I would like to share my experience with you. I would like to talk about the different settings and different features of these cameras, and I would like to talk about which camera I would prefer using for astrophotography, and in the end I would like to show you some images I've captured with these two different cameras in deep sky astrophotography. And as you can see in the background, I've listed up different features that are very important for me for deep sky astrophotography when planning to use a DSLR camera. So in this video I would like to go through these different details step by step, and I would like to compare both cameras. But before comparing both cameras, I would like to mention that this video is not sponsored, I'm not being paid for it, and all products shown in this video were purchased by myself. But now I would like to start by comparing both cameras. So first of all, I would like to talk about the sensor. So the sensor is a very important part of a camera because there are different sensors when it comes to DSLR cameras. So it's very important to talk about the sensor. So now let's talk about the sensor first. First of all, there's a big difference between both cameras. So the very first camera, so the Canon EOS 450D, has an APS-C sensor, and the Canon EOS 6DA has a full-frame sensor. And that's a big difference, not only about the sensor, but also about the equipment that you'll be able to use in combination with these cameras. So it's very important to keep in mind that a full-frame camera is quite big. And in astrophotography, usually we use telescopes or lenses. And the problem is that there are a lot of telescopes and lenses that are not suitable for these full-frame cameras. And that is a big mistake I made myself in the beginning. So I used a relatively cheap telescope. It was not that cheap, but it was not designed for full-frame cameras. And I've used that telescope in combination with a full-frame camera, and the results were not that good, as expected. And that is important to mention. So if you're planning to use a full-frame camera for astrophotography, definitely make sure to use a telescope that is actually suitable for these full-frame cameras. So I was able to use, for example, the Skywatcher 150 PDS telescope in combination with a full-frame camera, and this telescope is actually not suitable for full-frame cameras. By post-processing, I was able to edit the image so that I was able to bring out a lot of structures in the object. But still, especially in the beginning, it can be very challenging. Therefore, definitely keep that in mind, that your telescope is suitable for full-frame cameras. At least that is definitely an advantage. Generally speaking, full-frame cameras are a bit better for astrophotography because these cameras do have less noise, at least when using these DSLR cameras. So for sure, when using a cooled, dedicated astrophotography camera, these cameras will have less noise because they are cooled, which is a very important aspect. But in this case, for astrophotography, a full-frame camera is better. But keep in mind that some telescopes are not suitable for full-frame cameras. The next important aspect I would like to talk about are the megapixels. So there's a big difference in this case as well. So the Canon EOS 450D has 12.2 megapixels, and the Canon EOS 6D has 20.2 megapixels. So this is always an important aspect to talk about, but when comparing the megapixels of these cameras with these dedicated astrophotography cameras, you will quickly realize that it's not that important to have a lot of megapixels, but still, when cropping your image a lot, it is quite helpful to have a lot of megapixels. But in this case, I guess both cameras are quite suitable for astrophotography. But I wanted to share that with you because there's definitely a difference between both DSLR cameras. The next aspect I would like to talk about is the ISO range. So the different ISO values that you can select. And there's a very big difference when using these two cameras. So when using the Canon EOS 450D, you can select an ISO value between 100 and 1600. And when using the Canon EOS 6D, you can use an ISO value of more than 100,000. So first of all, it's very important to mention for me that the ISO value, so you will not need an ISO value of more than 100,000 in deep sky astrophotography. So when doing astrophotography with these DSLR cameras, I am using an ISO value of, let's say, 800 to 3200, so something in that range, and you can clearly see that both cameras are in that range. So it's not necessary or not important to use an ISO value of 60,000 for astrophotography, but still when planning to capture time-lapse videos of a night sky, and when using a very short exposure time, it can be helpful having a relatively high ISO value, but for astrophotography, an ISO value of around 1600 is definitely good. The next aspect I would like to talk about is a manual mode. So when planning to use a DSLR camera for astrophotography, and when not using an Astro computer, for example, and when not controlling your DSLR camera with a laptop, for example, it's very important that your camera has a manual mode. Manual mode means that you can control the different settings, like the exposure time, the ISO value, or the aperture. And that is super important because you have to be able to fully control your DSLR camera. So it's very important for you to be able to select these settings yourself. In this case, both cameras do have a manual mode, which is very important. The next aspect is the live view mode. Live view mode means that you can see on your display what your camera is capturing right now. That's a great feature for focusing on a bright star, for example. So in this case, it can be very helpful having a live view mode. In this case, both cameras do have a live view mode, which is definitely quite good. The next aspect is RAW. So it's very important that you can capture your images in RAW. When capturing your images in RAW, it's easier for you to process these images in post-processing. And for example, when stacking these images later on in Deep Sky Stacker, for example, it's very important that your images are captured in RAW. In this case, both cameras can do so, which is good. If you are not controlling your DSLR camera with an Astro computer like the CWO ASI Air Pro, for example, or with a laptop, it's important to control your camera with a remote shutter release cable. Therefore, I really recommend buying a camera that has a remote shutter release cable, because in astrophotography you would like to capture multiple images all night long because you're planning to stack these images later on. And when not having a remote shutter release cable, you have to manually press on your camera every time you plan to capture an image. And there are two problems with that. So first of all, when pressing on the button, your entire setup will move, which means that you'll get star trails in the end. And on the other side, it's not a good idea just pressing on the camera button all night long in order to take images. Therefore, try to buy a camera that has a connection for a remote shutter release cable. In this case, both cameras can do so, and that's a very important feature, definitely. The next aspect is a flip screen. It's a quite helpful feature for astrophotography, especially when capturing objects in night sky that are very high in the night sky. In this case, both cameras do not have a flip screen, which is not that good, but still you can capture great images of the night sky. But having a flip screen is definitely quite nice, I guess. So if you're planning to buy a camera with a flip screen, I would recommend buying the Canon EOS 600D. I've used that camera multiple times, and it's definitely quite good. The next aspect is bulb mode. It's very important that your camera has a bulb mode. For sure, you can also do deep sky astrophotography without a bulb mode, but then your exposure time has to be relatively short, which is not that good. So when not having a bulb mode, the maximum exposure time you can use is 30 seconds. For sure, you can also do astrophotography with 30 seconds of total exposure time. For sure, then you have to stack more images later on. But having a bulb mode is quite helpful because you can use a longer exposure time. So I personally sometimes use an exposure time of 5 minutes, and that is definitely possible with a bulb mode. The next important aspect is the exposure time. So you can use a maximum exposure time of 30 seconds, as I have already mentioned, in manual mode. And when switching to bulb, you can use a longer exposure time. The next aspect I would like to talk about is how heavy the DSLR camera is. So in this case, the Canon EOS 6D is a bit heavier. I'm planning to talk about that because sometimes, especially when using these smaller star trackers, such as the iOptron Skyguider Pro, for example, you do have a payload capacity, so a maximum payload capacity of 5 kilograms. And when using a very heavy camera, it might be challenging in the end, but in this case, both cameras are definitely quite suitable for a very portable astrophotography setup. The next important aspect is the price. So I personally bought both cameras used, and I bought the Canon EOS 450D for around 50 euros and the Canon EOS 6D for 350 euros. But I bought the Astro modified version of this camera, which is a bit better for astrophotography in the end, but you can use both versions for astrophotography. So generally speaking, the Astro modified version is sometimes a bit more expensive, but usually the prices are in that range. So the Canon EOS 6D is definitely more expensive. So after talking about these different details, I'm now planning to show you some images I've captured with both cameras, and in the end I would like to compare both cameras and talk about which camera I would more recommend for astrophotography. So this is the first image I would like to share with you. So this image was captured with the Canon EOS 450D. So I've used an exposure time of, let's see, 30 seconds because that's the maximum exposure time. I've used a total exposure time of 45 minutes, which is unfortunately not that long, and I've used the maximum ISO value, so 1600. So in this image you can see the Andromeda galaxy, and I was pretty surprised by how good this camera actually is. So this is definitely the cheapest camera I've ever used, and I was not expecting to capture images like this one. For sure you have to keep in mind that this is a very short exposure time. Keep that in mind. So usually I'm planning to use a total exposure time of 6 hours or more than 10 hours, but this is less than an hour, and still you can already see a few great structures in the galaxy. And even when zooming in, you can see that we do have relatively less noise. So definitely I was pretty surprised by how good this camera actually is, considering the low price of this camera. Now let's go over to some images I've captured with the Canon EOS 6D, which is the Astro modified version. So for example, I've captured this image of the Blue Horsehead Nebula on La Palma. This image has a total exposure time of under 1 hour once again. In this case, we do have a total exposure time of 56 minutes, so not that long as well. And you can see some great structures in this object. In this case, noise is a bit noticeable, but I've used a higher ISO value in this case, and the temperatures were higher. So I've captured this image during summer and the picture of the Andromeda galaxy when it was a bit colder. So definitely keep that in mind. So when capturing images during summer and when the temperatures are higher, you will have more noise in your images when using a DSLR camera. So now let's go over to another image I've captured with the Canon EOS 6D, which is this image, for example. I've captured this image a few weeks ago. I'm quite happy with that. The last image I would like to share with you is this image of the North American Nebula. It's a good image as well, and in this case, so we're planning to capture this object. It's very helpful to use an Astro modified DSLR camera. So much said about these different cameras. Now let's switch back to the different details about these cameras. So now I would like to talk about which DSLR camera is better for astrophotography. In this case, I guess it's relatively easy to say which DSLR camera is better. So when it comes to the sensor of the camera, the different features, the signal to noise ratio, and generally speaking, when looking at both cameras, I would definitely go for the Canon EOS 6D. So for sure, especially in the beginning, when not using a telescope that is suitable for full-frame cameras, it can be very challenging using a full-frame camera. But still in this case, the Canon EOS 6D has less noise compared to the 450D, and I personally really like to use the Canon EOS 6D. And if your telescope is suitable for full-frame cameras, just go for the 6D. It's way better compared to the 450D. If you're planning to start into the hobby of astrophotography and you're not planning to invest a lot of money, you can go for the Canon EOS 450D, but you have to keep in mind that it's a very old camera. So as you can see, it was released in 2008, and the sensor is quite old, and for sure you can see that you can capture good images. As you can see with the image I've shown you of the Andromeda galaxy, it is definitely possible, but generally speaking, Canon EOS 6D is definitely way better. So in this case, it's definitely quite easy for me to answer that question. So I've used both cameras multiple times. In this case, I would definitely recommend using the Canon EOS 6D. If you have any further questions about both cameras, definitely feel free to ask me down below in the comments, and I will definitely help you. And if you are interested in buying a Canon EOS 2000D, a Canon EOS 600D, or one of these cameras, I've already uploaded some videos about these DSLR cameras. So if you're interested in that, definitely make sure to check out these videos. And if this video was interesting and helpful to you, I would really appreciate a like and a subscription. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, clear skies, Felix.